All right, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We're just waiting to see if some more people are going to join. My name's Charlotte, and I'm the Environment Officer at the Alice Springs Town Council. Alex from Heritage will be presenting the home composting workshop for us today. All right, Alex.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. We've got you muted, so I can't really hear, but I hope everyone's doing well out there. And yeah, hope we get a few more people joining in along the way as well. I'm here sitting in my backyard, ready to present the workshop to you. So I hope you have a nice background there. And I hope the sun's not shining direct in the camera. Let me know if there's any issues.
Sorry, Alex, I just forgot to mention, if we'll just leave all the questions till the end, and there's two options to ask questions, either through the Q&A button, or there's a lift your hand button on the bottom right hand corner as well. We'll wait for questions until the end. We'll go through the written ones first, and then we'll take live questions. All right, sorry, Alex.
No worries. No worries. Look, and I guess if there's any technical issues as well, just message Charlotte on the Q&A and she can respond and resolve them as we go. Good. Okay, so composting at home. This is a workshop that Alice Springs Town Council is obviously putting on as part of their work around reducing waste. And we'll be looking at how you can compost at home, particularly what you can do with your food scraps and how to compost them. We've got a presentation here, and I guess, Charlotte, you and I can discuss about how to make this available to people later, if anybody wants a copy. So,
yep, we'll be putting this up on the Facebook page after. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sounds good. All right. So you should all be able to see the presentation now, composting at home. Is that right, Charlotte?
Yep.
Great. Good. Okay. So when it comes to composting at home, I think a really good question to ask yourself is, why do you want to compost at home? Why should we compost at home? And I think there's two main reasons: to reduce waste and to produce fertilizer for your garden. When it comes to the reducing waste side of things, there's this great little graphic I found here from Compost Revolution, showing that nationally, we produce 5.3 million tonnes of food waste going into landfill every year. And that in turn, by rotting down and producing methane, produces 16.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent released into the atmosphere each year from food waste. It also releases acid poison into the groundwater. So if we can reduce the amount of food waste going into landfill, then we can reduce both the amount of space we're using in landfill, and particularly we can reduce the carbon emissions associated with it. So here in Alice Springs, we're looking at 7.6 kilograms of organics per household per week, and about half of that is food waste. Now, Charlotte has one or two things to share about what Council's doing in this area. I'll just throw it to you quickly, Charlotte.
Yep. So Council is currently running a food organics, garden organics trial. So that means we're experimenting having green bins on your curbside and collecting your food waste and turning it into compost. The trial's in the process to being run out to 200 households in the community. And the aim of this trial is to, in the future, have it rolled out to the whole community.
Excellent. So that's really good to hear that there are initiatives like that happening in Alice Springs. And that will make a huge impact on the amount of waste going into landfill. It might also have some impact on the decisions you make at home about how you're going to compost at home. So remember when I said there's these two reasons, reducing waste and producing fertilizer? I think it's really worth asking yourself which one of them is more important to you, because it'll make a difference as to how you compost. If reducing waste is more important to you, then what you'll be doing is trying to compost as much of your waste as you possibly can, even the difficult stuff. Or maybe you're better off just giving all of that stuff and the difficult to compost stuff to town council and having them compost it once that system's up and running. If it's more important to you to produce really good quality fertilizer, well, there's a whole bunch of difficult to compost things that you might leave out of your compost heap, and you will instead go for just the really high quality ingredients in your compost to produce the best quality compost you can. So you're still composting at home either way, but you can see how it starts to affect the decisions you make about how you're going to do it. So I think that's a really good question to ask yourself at the start. Why are you wanting to compost at home? You can certainly do both, but one of them might be a priority. Okay, now when it comes to compost, there are lots of different sorts of compost made in all sorts of different ways, and you can see a few examples here from industrial scale to backyard level and worms and all sorts. It's probably worth defining a little bit what we're talking about when we're talking about compost and what's not what compost isn't. So there is actually an Australian standard for compost, believe it or not. And bag compost that you'll buy at the nursery or something like that should have an Australian standard little label on it. And the Australian standard for compost outlines that compost is essentially organic material that's been through a biological process, so bacteria, to produce a garden amendment, something you put in your garden. Or soil amendment, I believe is the term they use. Now it gets way more complicated than that, but those three things are really important. We're talking about organic stuff. We're not talking about inorganic things like rocks or cement or anything like that. Obviously, it's organic stuff, things that have lived, and it's going through a biological process, a bacterial process to change it into something that you can add to your soil. So it doesn't matter whether it's industrial level or at the backyard level. We're still talking about the same kind of thing, even though there's a whole range of different products you can make out of that, from composted mulches to potting mixes and worm castings and all sorts. They've still been through that process. So when we talk about backyard level stuff, which is what we're focused on today, there's also a range of ways you can compost in your backyard, and we're not going to talk about all of them here. I'll mention the range of them, but we're going to focus in on one in particular. So there's closed bins where the bins are entirely sealed or mostly sealed. There's aerated bins where the bins have holes in them for aeration, so they're not sealed. There's tumblers, which some of you might be familiar with. There's bokashi bins, which is starting to get quite different. That's an anaerobic method of composting, as opposed to all the others, which are aerobic methods of composting. And that just comes down to the type of bacteria that is doing the composting for you. The aerobic bacteria, which are the ones we are going to be looking at, are ones that need oxygen to compost. The anaerobic ones, they do their job in an environment that has a complete lack of oxygen, so underwater or sealed or something like that. So bokashi is quite different. It's much more similar to pickling or fermenting or something like that, bokashi. And then there's worm farms as well, which are technically not going through a bacterial process. It's a larger animal that's doing the composting for you at that point. So it's really a type of manure. I won't go into worms today either, because they are a little bit more complicated here in Alice Springs. It's hard to keep them alive during the summer. So if you want to know more about that, that's something for another day, and you can certainly research stuff online there. So we're looking at the top three mostly. And I am going to recommend, if you want to compost at home, I would say the best type of bin to use is a sealed bin. The reason for this is, with a sealed bin, you can control the moisture a lot better, which is an issue here in Alice Springs. But most importantly, it just keeps the pests out a lot better. We know that flies are a real issue here. If you go for an aerated bin with holes in it, it's going to get fly blown. All those flies are going to come straight in your house. So that's really not a great outcome. With the sealed bins, you can control for flies and for cockroaches, and you can even control for mice and rats and things like that much better. Certainly it keeps dogs out if that's an issue for you. So I would definitely recommend sealed bins. There's a whole range of them. This one that you can see on the slide is called a Gedia bin. And they're available at all sorts of nurseries and outlets and whatnot. It's not the only sort of sealed bin I recommend. It's just a picture that I found. I happen to use these at home. I think they're quite good, but no one's paying me to say that. There's all sorts of sealed bins that you can use that are going to do a very good job. Okay, so what are you going to need to do composting at home? Well, the essential bits are you're going to need your outside bin. That's your sealed bin. You're going to need some sort of kitchen caddy or something of the sort to carry all of your scraps from the kitchen to your bin on a daily basis. You'll probably need a shovel and some gloves. You'll need the kitchen scraps, and you'll definitely need some dry leaves or straw. This is really essential for the composting process. It has to be a mix of kitchen scraps and dry leaves or straw. So we're talking green and brown ingredients there, carbon and nitrogen. We'll get into that later. And personally, the way I do it at home is I have a bale of straw that I just keep next to my compost bin. And every time I put the kitchen scraps in, I put in an equal amount of the straw. Dry leaves from your garden's also great. Grass clippings can also be good too. We'll get into what's good and what's not good later, but there's a range of stuff you can use there with the kitchen scraps, but dry leaves and straw are probably the best way to go. There's a few optional things as well. You can get some other compost that's working well as a bit of a seed, seeding the bacteria into it. You probably only need a shovelful of that. A compost stirrer, you can see the pictures of them here, these compost stirrers. I think they're a really great idea if you want to mix your compost in a sealed container. There's other ways to do it. You can use a pitchfork, or there's other sorts of compost stirrers as well. Not just these, but the corkscrew ones I've had a lot of success with. I think they're pretty good. And the other option is compost spray. So this is basically a liquid that has compost bacteria in it. And if you spray it in your compost heap, it just helps it get going quicker. It gets the bacteria going quicker. The bacteria you need in your compost heap already exist in the soil. So it is enough for you to just put your kitchen scraps and your dry leaves and straw in, and the bacteria will start breeding. But if you want to get it going quicker, or if you're running into trouble there, then compost spray is a really good way to go. Okay, so in terms of the process, what to do? Right, well, first, I would be recommending that you dig your bin into the ground about 100 millimeters. Okay, so that means dig a ring shape, 100 millimeters deep, put your bin in it, so it should be the size of your bin, and then bury the bottom of your bin to about 100 mil. This will stop pests getting in. Particularly, it'll slow down rats and mice, and slow down dogs and whatnot. Inside your bin, I'd then recommend putting a layer of sticks at the bottom. They don't have to be very big. You could even use coarse straw or mulch if you have it, but I think sticks are probably best. The reason for this is just to make sure that your bottom layer remains aerated and gets a bit of drainage. I used to think, oh, here in the desert we don't really need that. Surely we can just do it without it. And I've done it plenty without it, but when I do it with the sticks in there, I find it does work better. It just helps that drainage at the bottom. You just get a less mucky compost heap at the bottom. So I think it's a good way to go. They don't properly break down in the end, but that's okay. You can just pull them out, use them in the next one, or something of the sort. Okay, so once you've got your bin in the ground and you've got your layer of sticks at the bottom, you are then going to start layering your scraps and your straw or leaves in alternating layers. So kitchen scraps, straw, kitchen scraps, straw. That means every day when you bring out your bucket of kitchen scraps, you're going to need to put a layer of straw on top of them, not underneath. You want the straw on top of the kitchen scraps, so that while it's sitting there for a day, waiting for you to come back out the next day, it's got straw on top. Okay, that's important. It keeps the moisture in, it stops the flies breeding, it does all sorts of things. Now, you can see over on the right-hand side, the green little box there, saying if you do about equal parts of kitchen scraps and straw, so, and I'm talking volume here, not weight, like we can't weigh it, so just use your eye and make it a similar volume of kitchen scraps to straw, that will give you the ratio of carbon to nitrogen that you need. You may have heard people say things like, oh, you need a ratio of 25:1 carbon to nitrogen, or 20:1, or whatever it is. And that's true. The best recipes for compost do involve that kind of ratio. You don't have to worry about measuring it at home. Just do equal parts and it will work out pretty well. If anything, I'd lean towards slightly more carbon to nitrogen, so slightly more of your straw and leaves compared to your kitchen scraps. Just play it by ear, experiment, see how you go. Now you can see the little circle down the bottom. This is a really important part of having a successful compost heap at home. make sure that all of your kitchen scraps are cut small to golf ball size or smaller. Okay, you don't want big chunks of things like, you know, pumpkin or, you know, bread or anything like that just sitting in the middle of your compost heap. It won't break down, and if it's not breaking down in compost, it means it's rotting. So you've just got a pile of rotting food in your backyard. You don't want that. So take the time to cut it up small in the kitchen before you bring it out. It's the best way to go. The last thing that I'm saying there is, yeah, add some seed compost early on. So early on in your pile, just to get it all going. It's optional, you don't have to, it'll work fine without it, but it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea. And just remember in the top right, you can see there, what your compost bacteria needs to live is it needs air because it's anaerobic compost. It needs water because they will shut down in a dry environment, and they need to feed on carbon and nitrogen. Okay, so it needs that dry and the kitchen scraps. It needs all of those things to keep going. All right, there's a couple of different ways you can manage your compost heap once it's up and running and once you're adding all the layers to it. There's the hot compost method and a cold compost method. The hot compost method, it's pretty simple. It just means that you're stirring it regularly. So you'll need one of those corkscrew stirrers or something similar, and you need to be stirring it pretty regularly. This will keep it really well aerated, and it will mean that the compost heap is composting at a pretty high rate as you're going. The cold compost method means you don't stir it. You just layer it and you leave it. This is a slower method, but it's less work. So if say you're elderly or living with a disability or something, and it's harder work for you to be turning that compost heap all the time, cold compost is a great method. If you're just busy and don't have the time to be turning it, some people don't. Cold compost is a great method. It will take longer. Okay. So for instance, once your bin is full, and when I say full, what I really mean is 80% full. Don't try and fill it the whole way full. It just means it's a lot harder to manage. If you're using the hot composting method and you keep stirring it once it's full, your compost should be ready to use in about 2 to 4 weeks. Certainly no sooner than 2, but you might be lucky. It might be quicker than 4. However, with the cold compost method, you do need to give it a lot longer to cure. So you fill it to the 80%, and then you need to put the lid on. Sorry, you need to cover your compost with soil to seal in all the moisture, because you're going to leave it a long time. You don't want it to dry out. Cover it with soil, close the lid, and wait for 2 weeks. Once you come back after 2 weeks, you'll see that what's happened is it's actually, it starts to dry a little, and it comes away from the edge of the compost bin. There'll be a gap between the compost and the bin. So the compost is shrinking as it breaks down and as it dries a little. What you want to do then is you want to fill those gaps with soil and cover it again with soil and leave the lid off now. You're going to leave it for 10 weeks. And then at the end of 10 weeks, it's going to be cured and ready to use. Okay, so you can see that takes 12 weeks after you've finished. It takes a lot longer, but it's a lot less work. So, you know, pick the method that's right for you, hot compost or cold compost. Okay, how do I know when my compost is ready? Well, the best way is to use your senses, to get it in your hands and to feel it. It should feel light and a bit moist, not dry. And it should feel crumbly, not sticky and big clods. It should be even and dark brown in color, or black. Black's also good. And when you smell it, it should smell good. All right, it shouldn't smell bad. It should smell earthy and a little sweet. But if it smells sour or stinky or anything like that, it's not ready or something's gone wrong. Okay. And I think possibly one of the best ways to work out if your compost is ready is when you look at it, you shouldn't really be able to recognize any of the stuff that you put in it at the start. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you can see there's eggshells, there's corn husks, there's banana peel. That's not ready. On the right-hand side, you can't really see many of the ingredients. You can't tell what they are. They've broken down. This compost looks a little sticky. Sometimes you get compost that are drier and crumblier. But if I had that stuff in my hand, I'd be saying, yeah, that's ready. I'd put it in my garden. That looks all right. Okay. So this is a common question people have. What can I put in my compost heap and what can't I? before I dive into this, I think it's really worth being clear. Often people hear rules about what you can and can't put into your worm farm and assume it's the same for your compost heap, okay? It's not exactly the same. Although, to be honest, if you followed the rules for what you can and can't put in a worm farm and did composting with that, you'd have a really good compost heap because you'd be composting all of the really easy to compost stuff and you get a really nice compost heap out of it. However, you can add some things to compost that you can't to worm farms. For instance, this list here on the left, citrus, onions, bread, oil, dairy, some weeds, grass clippings, bamboo, cutlery and crockery, so your biodegradable stuff. You can add them at home if you want to, but you do have to be a bit careful with them. So I'd only be adding small quantities at a time and I'd be cutting them up pretty small and I'd be experimenting with them if you're not sure. So, you know, don't do something like take home all of the bamboo, cutlery and crockery from an event and think that you can just shove it all in your compost heap and it'll compost. It won't. A lot of that stuff's designed to be industrial or composted. So yeah, you'll need to cut it up and just try bits at a time. That's particularly the case with citrus and onions and bread. Bread is often a bit of a killer that people don't realize. You think bread's fine in your compost heap, but if you're putting whole slices in or whole lumps of bread, it can just sit there and do nothing. So you do need to cut it up. Oil's probably best left out of your compost heap, but if you've got little bits, you can put it in. And then, yeah, the rest of that list there. There are some things that I would say definitely don't put in your composted heap at home. Pet droppings is a key one. Cats and dogs. They contain all sorts of pathogens that can make you sick. And so it's really important to not get that into your compost heap. Meat and bones. I wouldn't do it at home. It can be done industrially. I wouldn't try it at home. It's too much work. Certainly bones, you'll never break them down. You'll just end up with bones in your compost heap. And meat and fish as well, you run the risk of them just sitting there rotting and attracting dogs and things like that. So I wouldn't be putting them in your compost heap. I would definitely not put couch grass in your compost heap because it's still alive and it will just grow in your compost heap. The best thing to do with couch grass, and in fact other listed weeds as well, listed weeds are weeds that the NT government has declared as a weed. Any of them, I would be putting it in your bin and having it go down to the tip. That's certainly the recommendation of Landcare and the Weeds branch, because Alice Springs Town Council have good protocols in place for management of weeds at the tip, and they can manage that stuff down there. It shouldn't go into green waste. Don't put it into green waste. Nobody wants your weeds in the mulch they're buying from council. Put it into general waste, and then council is able to manage that. Charlotte, do you want to say anything more about that, just while I'm talking about that?
Yeah, well, part of the FOGO trial, or one of the benefits of the food organics, garden organics trial, is that you can actually include things like meat and bones and fish, because it's composting on a larger scale, they will actually break down. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, that list on the right there of definitely don't compost at home. A lot of that, in fact, just about all of it can be composted by town council. So yeah, that's a great way to go. Good point, Charlotte. Thank you. Perhaps the only things that can't be are the non-organic materials. So, you know, rocks, concrete, plastic. You can't compost that stuff. It's not organic. Nobody can compost it. An interesting one is biodegradable plastics. Okay, they're often designed to be composted at a facility like what Town Council will be running. They're not designed to be composted at home. Your compost heap is not big enough and it's not hot enough to be able to do it. And disposable coffee cups in particular, don't try and compost them. They have a plastic layer on the inside that's not organic and can't be composted. So they need dealing with in a proper facility. Okay, so that's the list of what you can and can't compost. In terms of troubleshooting, here's a great list. This is often questions that I get asked about compost. You know, my compost smells bad, what's going wrong? Or it's not breaking down, it's slimy, or I've got flies and maggots in it. These are all really common problems. Don't worry if you've got these problems, it's not just you. Everyone gets these issues with compost and it just needs a bit of managing. Usually it comes down to one of two things. It's either not got enough oxygen, so it needs more aerating, or it's drying out, and so it needs more moisture. So you can see if it smells bad, you've got not enough oxygen, and you're probably not enough carbon. If you had more carbon in there, which is your dry straw and leaves and things like that, it would be naturally oxygenating it more, be aerating it more, and also to be heating it up more. So you can try turning your compost and adding bulky carbon materials or pulling it apart. If you really need to, sorry, that last one, you can pull it apart and put it into a compost heap to try and resurrect it, but that's sort of a last resort option, that one. As we go down this list, you can see that a lot of the solutions are pretty similar, okay? So if it smells bad, if it's slimy, or if you've got flies, they're all issues to do with your compost heap being too wet and not enough oxygen and probably not enough carbon. So the solutions are all similar. If you've got issues of it's not breaking down, it's got powdery grey mold, or it's got ants and cockroaches, it's too dry at that point. So did I say too dry last time? I think I got that wrong. For the smells bad and slimy and flies, that's too wet. Too wet, not enough oxygen. Apologies. Whereas if it's dried out and has cockroaches and whatnot, it's too dry. So not enough moisture and probably not enough nitrogen. You need more kitchen scraps and things like that in there. You could add manure as well if you needed to get it going. The only other one that needs a slightly different solution is if you've got mice or rats or dogs or something like that getting in, then probably your compost bin is not sealed well enough. You might need to cut your scraps up smaller as well. And I'd definitely be looking at pulling out any of the difficult stuff if you're trying to compost anything difficult. Sorry, the builders are just going next door. I hope everyone can still hear me despite the steel being cut. Apologies. A good trick that I got told a while ago to stop rats and mice getting into your compost heap is when you're digging it into the ground, put a layer of chicken wire underneath it while you dig it in, and that will stop them getting in. It will need to be fairly fine chicken wire. You know, mice in particular are pretty small. It can get through pretty small holes, but that's a good way to keep out rats and mice and dogs and whatnot. Okay. Well, everybody, that is the end of the presentation. So what we'll do now is, if anybody has any questions, we might have a bit of time for questions. I think there's about 20 minutes left. So Charlotte, how do we want to do this?
Yep, so I've got two questions here from Sharon. So one is, why do you not recommend the tumbler bins over the sealed bins?
Oh, okay. Look, no, tumblers are great as well. I don't have any problem with tumblers. And if you're using a tumbler, keep going. They're great. I do think the sealed bins are a little better just because they tend to control moisture a bit more. You need to be a little careful with tumblers because when they're not full enough, they dry out quickly. And when they're too full, they're hard to manage and hard to get things to break down in. But they're certainly a great option. Tumblers can work really well. I'd just be really careful about making sure you're cutting your stuff up small and getting the right mix of kitchen scraps to your dry material in there. So keep experimenting with that. You may find that when you're starting off a new tumbler, you might need to water it a little bit just because they can dry out at the start when there's not a lot of material in them, and particularly in the summertime. So they're problems that people run into with tumblers. But tumblers are a great way to go. I would say the two options that I would recommend in general are sealed bins and tumblers. I really wouldn't recommend the aerated bins. So tumblers are fine.
Right. The other question was, can horse manure be used as a substitute for a straw and leaf layer?
Well, look, manure in general, that's something that people debate backwards and forwards in compost circles about whether you should consider it a carbon material or a nitrogen material, because it kind of has both. If you're talking dried horse manure, then yes, you probably do want to wet it down a little. It needs to be a little moist, but I wouldn't be using fresh horse manure. Like if you have your own horses and you're, basically taking the manure daily, no, I wouldn't say that's a great idea in your home compost heap. But if you've got access to sort of, scrapings from a stable or something like that, mucked out stables, yeah, that could be fine. Give it a go. Just make sure that you're not getting big dried lumps in there. You might want to break it up a bit and make sure there's a bit of moisture. But yeah, I think dry horse manure should be fine. Generally, what I tend to recommend for if you're going to use manure is to not use a bin so much, but go and make yourself a big pile. So we didn't go into piles this time around because it's a different way of making compost, and it's really not good for using kitchen scraps in, because if you just put your kitchen scraps into a big pile of manure that's open, well, you've just got a big pile of, food sitting in the back of your garden that dogs and, mice and everything are going to get into. But if you're talking manure, you certainly can make a big pile. It needs to be minimum a metre by a metre by a metre, and you need to build it in layers and water it and everything. So there's a whole other method there. But that's probably more what I'd recommend for horse manure, to be quite honest. I think the other reason why it's worth doing that method for horse manure and camel manure in particular is they tend to have nematodes in them. So for experienced gardeners around here, you would have come across nematodes, which is a microscopic soil worm. Essentially, it's a type of worm. It's not an earthworm. They're not beneficial, and you tend to get them in horse and camel manure. And so you'd need to be getting your compost pretty hot to get rid of the nematodes. So that's probably a better use of your horse manure, to be quite honest.
And the nematodes aren't good because they can get into your tomato crop and that kind of stuff, hey?
That's right. Yeah. What they end up doing is they end up feeding on the roots of your vegetables, and it really stunts the growth of your veggies. So yeah, people who've been gardening here a long time would have come across them for sure. And if you pull out your plant and you see that the roots have like nodules all over them, like really knotted and gnarly, then you've got nematodes. There are ways you can deal with it. Some plants are less susceptible than others. Apparently asparagus doesn't mind nematodes at all. And you can use things like marigolds to try and get rid of them, but you need to go pretty hardcore with that. I've also seen people solarize whole garden beds with black plastic to kill the nematodes. Probably the best thing you can do is just try and keep nematodes out as long as you can. So yeah, a bit of garden cleanliness and hygiene is the best way to go.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions? If so, could you please type in the Q&A box or raise your hand? And if not, we'll bring this session to an end. All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex. That was very informative. I enjoyed that presentation.
Well, thanks, everyone. Small crowd, but dedicated.
All right, everyone. Yeah, and like I said, this video will be available online as well. All right. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye.
Bye.